So joining us today is a tremendous guest to Northeast Ohio and the Cleveland Leadership Center, Dr. Robert Boyer. President Boyer became the 24th president of Hiram College in 2024, bringing with him more than 2 decades of experience as a faculty member, academic leader, and advocate for student success. And I have to say his arrival was perfectly, truly timed because in 2025, Hiram is marking its 175th anniversary. So what a celebration. Before coming to Hiram, President Boyer served in a variety of leadership roles at Gettysburg College, where he spent more than 20 years. Most recently, he was the Senior Associate Provost for Academic Success, a position in which he collaborated with campus partners to strengthen enrollment, increase student persistence, and elevate the overall student experience. Today, President Boyer will help us explore the ways in which Hiram College has a distinctive approach to developing the adaptable, well-rounded leaders that our complex world demands. We'll also be discussing why President Boyer believes liberal arts education remains more relevant than ever in preparing students not just for their first job, but for a lifetime of meaningful contribution. Please join me in welcoming President Robert Boyer.
Thank you, Becky. Thanks to all of you for tuning in today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. All right. Can you see that okay?
Good.
Yeah. So Becky, you did a wonderful job of covering. It's always awkward to listen to, your story out there or your history, but you did a great job of covering, I think, the highlights. I think the only thing I would add is I grew up in rural Nebraska, and that actually I'm a first generation college student, so that kind of drives some of the things that you'll be hearing me talk about. And so liberal arts leadership, lifetime, this has been something that is in my day-to-day life. And I did see a proud Hiram alum on there. I saw Jennifer Prue out there. So I like to say, our alumni are our best advertisement. And that really is something that I think when you hear our alumni stories and probably share a few of those with you today, outside of one very obvious one, but that really is, I think, the most compelling thing about the liberal arts is when you start to look at the stories that people tell. So I was going to, if you'll bear with me for a minute here, I wanted to go through and talk a little bit, very quick overview of what the liberal arts are, because this is something that actually just yesterday on campus, we were having a discussion of identity and what liberal arts means. So I'm going to try to cover 2,600 plus years very quickly. So keep that in mind. It comes back, we trace it back to Athens and the ancient Greeks. There's actually evidence that it was probably around in other places besides Athens, but that's the one that we have the historical record of. The liberal in that means for free education, but it was really about a free citizen. It was actually about the free mind and having the ability to think freely, critically. Now, free education in Athens, and we associate Athens with democracy, and there's definitely a connection with direct democracy in ancient Athens, but it was direct democracy and it was very limited. So the franchise who could engage in that was limited to males. It was many people were enslaved. Women were not included in this. So it's a very small but important part of democracy. And you see the Agora. That's actually a picture I was lucky enough 2 years ago to spend a little bit of time in Athens. And for a political scientist, who studies democracy, this is the ultimate nerd moment, watching there and seeing that the place where that happened. Traditionally, the liberal arts have consisted of, and the Greeks consisted of, the trivium and the quadrivium. And the trivium is grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. So particularly with the trivium, you think about people trying to convince their fellow Athenians of their arguments. Those are things that people had to be able to communicate well, be compelling in that, have solid logic, but then also have the background with some scientific things with astronomy and things like culture with music. So those were considered critical for self-rule. And that also had an influence when you think about the United States and the founding of the United States. So the liberal arts education was part of that. Harvard and Yale and the Ivy League schools were very important and critical to that. And even as they evolved in the 19th century, continued to be part of the importance of an American education system, which in some ways was somewhat revolutionary by itself. But also at the time, the Ivy Leagues moved away from what was the German model, which Germany really wasn't even the nation state as we know it today. But the model at that time, the Berlin University was a research university. And really the fundamental difference and where people point to that being really important for how it affects democracy and the state is the liberal arts model that the U.S. followed was more about civic virtue and in some ways altruism and working toward the civic good, whereas the research universities at the time were seen as in service to the state. And so that's just a kind of a different ethos of where they were coming from with that. Many of our liberal arts colleges, Hiram included, have links to religious institutions, and so they were to train clergy, but also in training the clergy, people wanted, a lot of times you would go out into communities where this would be a person who's the most highly educated person in that community. And so they thought it was important to have a broad, well-rounded classical type of education. So I'll talk a little bit and a little bit more about Hiram's actual founding. So the modern liberal arts, and this is sometimes where we have a lot of conversations about this, where people will say, well, you can't have liberal arts without X, without whatever discipline it is. But the consensus out there is that really it's not about a specific set of courses or majors, but it's really about a skill set. And those skill sets revolve around things like critical thinking skills, problem solving, having the depth to look at things from multiple perspectives, working in groups and collaborating with others. It's very human-centered in that way, where people are working together. Again, sticking with what the ancient Greeks had, writing and speaking and communicating, that's of course evolved, right? Because as we have, as we're on Zoom, obviously those are the ways that we communicate are different than they were even 10 years ago. And engaged learning. And this is something sometimes you'll hear it called experiential learning. Experiential learning is kind of a specific part of engaged learning, but the idea is that you're not just a vessel taking in information, but you're interacting with that information. You're interacting with the people around you. You're interacting with, even the Socratic method. When you think about that, it was Socrates was asking questions, getting answers, but that's evolved to be much more engaged with people who are around you, in addition to sometimes your community, and just having a set of learning that goes beyond just the self, and you're not just sitting there listening to a lecture. And then a focus to some extent on the common good and ethics. So it's beyond just the individual and what the individual can gain from that, but it's really about, these are questions that, should kind of like, what kind of a society, what is a good society? What is the public good? What serves that? The critiques, and there are many of the liberal arts, and so try to hit these head on. The one is, the nope, not practical, it lacks career specific skills. Every time I think about that, I'm showing my age with this, but I think of The Graduate and Dustin Hoffman's character, and like, what are you going to do when you get out? What are you going to do? And plastics, plastics, the idea of plastics. And I think about, well, plastics have certainly been important, but there are other skills that I think that we can and do well with the liberal arts. I'll get into this in a minute, where I think we've not necessarily made our case particularly well as an industry. Another critique that's connected to that is it's not valued by employers. I'm going to show you some evidence in a minute that says that's really not true, but I think that is related to our inability or lack of being able to make that case very effectively. Too expensive is another one. And then more recently, we've had the idea of too liberal. I think so. As someone who studied European politics, we've kind of perverted now. We're liberal, where it meant free and centrist and things like that. Now, the American version of liberal, which means left of center, has kind of like is in Europe as well. And so, but we see that as we're dealing with liberal arts. I actually had someone say to me, an emeritus board member when I first started here at Hiram, who said, maybe we should just drop the liberal arts, the name liberal arts. And it's like, in some ways that seems like surrendering, because that's, it goes back centuries, and really what it means is what it means. I think we just need to do a better job of explaining it. So this is, I think, very small. I apologize for that, but this is from the National Association of Colleges Employers. It's an annual survey done where we ask employers, what skills are you looking for in your graduates? And so when we think about do liberal arts supply skills that employers are looking for, the top one is problem solving skills, which is 80, almost 90% say problem solving skills. Well, that's critical thinking. That's the ability to look at things from different perspectives, ability to work in a team, which when we talk about that engaged learning, when we talk about teamwork, is actually one of the things that we deal with a lot, because we tend to have small classes. written communication, initiative, strong work ethic, technical skills, then communication skills and verbal communication skills, flexibility, adaptability. Then you get into analytical, quantitative skills, detail oriented, and then down about midway, a little bit low is computer skills, which are important. And then through creativity and things like that. So all of these things really are part and parcel of what the skill set is of the liberal arts. So I think that that's, when you ask employers now, I would say sometimes there's a disconnect between CEOs who tend to be very high on liberal arts skills and hiring managers who are looking at things to say, like, we need specifically a person who fits this skill set at this point in time. And again, that goes back to us not making our case maybe as well as we should have. The too expensive one is one that I think has some bearing, but I think also, again, we've kind of allowed the agenda to be set by others on that. The sticker price, this is something our sticker price, and on Hiram's sticker price is pretty reasonable. It's around $40,000 all in. But higher education as a whole has what I would call a very opaque pricing structure. It's in some ways akin to buying a car, right? Nobody's paying the same thing. You don't know. The other people, it depends on things like family income. It depends on things like whether or not a school even offers merit aid and then how much aid they have available to give out. So there are some things like true cost calculators. They're somewhat helpful, but it's pretty convoluted. I went through this on my own with my daughter, and so I understand this from a firsthand perspective on the other side of that. And we've only made limited progress in coming through with that. We have, at Hiram, we've just adopted a Hiram guarantee, which we guarantee tuition won't change when a student who's accepted coming in to try to help with that. But even then, as federal programs change, as your ability to offer scholarship dollars change, that can also create some problems with that. One of the things that, and this has been in the news a lot lately, there are tiers in higher education. I talked to someone recently who I thought had a good way of putting it, said we've gutted the middle class in some cases, that was their perspective in the United States, but also there's no middle in terms of higher education. There are the Ivy Leagues and the near Ivies, and then places like that have huge endowments. They're in the news a lot, and then they're also very expensive. They're one person's called them highly rejective, right? So they in part are very proud of the fact that they reject way more people than they accept into them. So they're very exclusive. And then there are schools that are essentially almost open enrollment or much more open to people there that do not have big endowments, do not charge as much for tuition. And there's not a lot in the middle in some ways. And this goes for, you have your large state schools, Penn State, Ohio State fit in that are state supported in some ways, but don't draw nearly as much state support as they once did. They're actually fairly expensive too for middle class families to afford. And then you have regional schools that are easier to get into and also tend to be lower cost. So it's happening all across the board, both publics and privates. Unfortunately, and I do think this is in part one of the issues that we've not done well, is at times I've had someone ask me, and it was an earnest question, ask me when I was in Washington, D.C. last spring when the endowment tax was coming down the pike. And they said, oh, how is that going to affect you? And I said, I really wish it did, because our endowment per student was not nearly high enough to even get to where that made an impact. But people associate schools like Hiram and others with the Harvards, Dartmouths, Browns, and that's just not an accurate. They're in a different world, and they do wonderful things, but they're fundamentally a different model. And affordability is something that we struggle with all the time on how do we charge as little, get students in here, make it as affordable as possible for them, but also it's still a business, right? You have to be able to cover your costs, and that's a huge challenge right now for schools like us that are small and have small endowments. We're pretty proud of the fact that we're typically fairly competitive with schools like Kent, which is a great school. We're obviously a very different option than Kent or Ohio State, but we try to stay competitive, but it's very difficult for us to do that. The too liberal part is something that it's an interesting narrative that's been out there. It's also something that's, this isn't the first time that this has come up. Definitely in the 60s, this was an issue. I actually get this more when I'm talking with alumni or people who are kind of adjacent, who are not maybe not even alums, but people who are just kind of interested in higher education. It's less of an issue, honestly, on campus, and I'll explain what I mean by that. Hiram does. I say in here, we have a broad base, and so we have students from rural Appalachia, white students from rural Appalachia. We have African American students from East Cleveland, and all kind. And we have students from Hawaii. We have students from Texas. We have a lot of students from all across the political map, the socioeconomic map. And so honestly, our students, we're about 60% of our students are student athletes. Almost all of our students work and work study or jobs on campus. And frankly, I've seen things that were, that were pro Kamala Harris. I've seen FJB, the posters on campus. You don't see a lot of either one of those. But a lot of times our students, and this as a political scientist worries me a little bit, there's some way times are kind of apathetic because of the polarization and negativity. So it's not been, there's small groups on either end of the political spectrum that are active, but I don't see the kind of like highly charged political document debates that are going on that sometimes are out in the news. So at Hiram, we've not really had that. And I think a lot of schools are like that. A lot of our students are just trying to get their hours in, trying to get done, and maybe they're just working hard. And a lot of them, don't have time and they're not engaged in politics. And sometimes, as I said, as a political scientist, somebody who cares about civic education, sometimes it concerns me that I think maybe there's too much apathy. But we've not seen a big swip, or the so-called woke campus isn't really something we see here. So a little bit about Hiram. We were founded as the Western Reserve Eclectic Institute, which I think is a pretty cool name, but it's a mouthful. In 1850, Hiram, like I mentioned, is connected with a church, although a lot of our students wouldn't even necessarily know that, but we are still connected with the Disciples of Christ. The disciples founded Hiram in 1850 in part because they wanted a place for their students, people who were members of the disciples, to go, their children to be able to get an education, because what they found is like maybe a Lutheran school would not allow them in because they gave preference to students who were Lutheran or Catholic or vice versa. And so it was founded in 1850. And one of the things very proud of this, as I mentioned, I'm from first gen. This is really important to me, is we like to say Hiram was open to anyone up for the challenge in 1850. And it's really something that Hiram, I'll talk about Garfield, but he met Lucretia Rudolph, who was here in 1850 taking the same curriculum that James Garfield was taking, which was very unusual at that time. I think Oberlin is the only other school in Ohio that was open to women at the time, and women had a separate curriculum at that time. So we're proud of that. Hiram's first African-American graduate was in the 1870s. I taught for many years at Gettysburg College, which is associated with Abraham Lincoln. And I used to teach a civil rights class there. And one of the things students would say, oh, we're talking about Little Rock in 1957. They'd say, that's terrible. And it's like Gettysburg's first African-American graduate was 1956. So it was the year before. So Hiram, I think, has been true to a very good, open ethic since its foundation. And it was founded in a place they actually use this language to avoid the distractions of urban areas so students could focus on their studies. Mission accomplished. All right. This sometimes is and like I said, I grew up in rural Nebraska. And so this is definitely an area. But the great thing is I grew up 3.5 hours from an airport and 40 minutes from a movie theater. We have access to Cleveland, Akron, Youngstown. We have access to a lot of areas, Pittsburgh even too. I would love to see us more engaged, as Becky and I have talked about, in the Cleveland area, because it's a great resource for us, but I think we're also a great resource for Cleveland. And so that was intentional, though, to set it up because to get people a little bit of distance so they can focus on that. It creates some challenges too, but I think overall it still works well. James Garfield is our most famous alumni, even though he really didn't graduate here. He came here. His father died when he was 2. He's got this great kind of rags to riches success story. He was a student, and then he ended up going to Williams College when he'd taken all the classes he could take here. He came back. He taught here. He was the principal, which is the equivalent of the president, as the Western Reserve Eclectic Institute. He started his political career from here. He had the Hiram Boys, where they went off and fought in the Civil War. So very much an important part of Garfield, and Garfield's a very important part of us. We currently have what we call the Urgent Challenges curriculum, which students all take a class on an urgent challenge. There's a couple of courses that each student has to take that are, enduring challenges, and then urgent challenges. Since September 11th, we've had a teach-in every September 11th, where you can run. It's just set up on the college quad out here in the green out here, where people will talk about things like, GMOs. They'll talk about using genetics, or, talking about like the efficacy or ethics in your kind of classical philosophy sense. It runs the gambit of things that folks will come out and teach, and students just come and listen to those. And also faculty and staff will engage with that too. Every one of our students has to go through what we call Hiram Connect, which is either guided research, an internship. Around over 60% do internships, which is great, and study away. A lot of students do more than one of these, but each student has to have that as an experience. Those are high impact practices, which George Koo has found are really important for people to, for students as for their kind of lifelong learning and continued growth. Very proud of the fact that Lauren Pope's original Colleges That Changed Lives, Hiram is in that edition. We're still part of the Colleges That Changed Lives. These are schools, Pope originally described it as a great place for B or B plus students, and kind of a place where you will learn a lot. They will do a lot of development of a person, and it's really transformational education that's offered at them. One of the things that we're called the hidden gem. I wish my argument is let's stop hiding. I think we need to make sure that people know about what we're doing. I've got the Garfield quote. Actually, Garfield is known as the education president by the Miller Center at the University of Virginia. He started the Bureau of Education, and so it's part of that tradition that we've continued on with that. A little on our profile, around 40% of our students are Pell eligible. And so that means that they are they are on lower socioeconomic status. Around 25% are first gen students. In the colleges of the Midwest, we recently were ranked 4th in social mobility, which is really important for us to do that. So students are coming in, it changes, it transforms, essentially creates generational wealth in a lot of cases for students who otherwise would not have that. We are primarily undergraduate. We do have a couple of different graduate programs, but our focus is really on undergraduate. And our largest majors right now are education, nursing, psychology, integrative exercise science. So you see some things that are actually professional programs in there. There's a mixture of those along with the traditional liberal arts. But again, all students go through a curriculum that is focused on the traditional liberal arts skills. Okay, so why is this important? So last night I was at a talk by an alum who worked in nuclear regulation, nuclear weapons regulation, and he was talking about the United States. He scared me, so I'm sorry, I'm going to share that with you. But he said the United States and China will not use AI in any part of their decision-making process on launching nuclear weapons. He said the Russians, however, will. And so he said, but the reason that the United States and Chinese don't want to do that is because they absolutely want to have the human element in there. And that is that critical thinking, being able to think about that. The reason the Russians, just by the way, will have kind of a machine learning part of that is because they trail the United States and China in terms of power and in terms of the size of their economy. And so that's why it's something to be seen in there. We all live in the information age or like the disinformation age where when you have on your phone access to, like I went to college in the 80s, we had the encyclopedias, you had to go to a card catalog. Now, instantaneously, we have way more information than we've ever had. If you ever watch late night TV and the commercials that come on, you see all kinds of different disinformation. We have bots that are sending things out. So these are all things that if you don't have critical thinking skills, if you don't understand communication and sourcing where things come from, even things as simple as like your prescriptions that you're taking, because if you need to understand like what were the trials that were done and does that make an impact, those are all things AI, disinformation that's out there, and being able to establish, it's increasingly more difficult to establish that kind of digital literacy that's so critical to that. I think the rapidly changing workforce, people going into the workforce today will change careers many times. There is no more of this, you go work for IBM, stay there and retire there most likely. So in fact, what we find is it's not even necessarily the first job so much as the second job that has become really critical. And so having those skills that you get part of a liberal arts education are really critical to continued progress in your career. And there's something to be said too for satisfaction and a life well lived. And I think that's part of what we try to do too. So, and I have this is the last part, but if you doubt me, this quote that says liberal arts education, not obsolete, the more valuable than ever. And it's because of the human skills, critical thinking, ethical reasoning, and creativity. And so if you're wondering the source of that, I put that into Google, and that's what Google AI tells us. So if you believe in AI, even AI is preaching to the choir on that one. So I found that interesting. So that is my part. Thank you so much for listening, and happy if there are questions, Becky.
Fabulous. Thank you. And let me just say, wow. I mean, clearly you are somebody hook, line, and sinker who has spent an awful lot of time thinking about and advocating for the value of a liberal arts education. So I'll just say, wow. And as the graduate of a liberal arts school, you had me at hello, but this was true.
Thanks.
So we have time for just a couple of quick questions. So you mentioned a couple of times how Hiram College and other similarly situated smaller liberal arts colleges are different from the bigger schools, the Ohio States, Penn State, by the way, big game this weekend, OH. Question to you is this: is there opportunity for small liberal arts colleges like Hiram to collaborate with one another, particularly as we're facing financial and demographic headwinds? And in light of the fact that Ohio has so many colleges and universities, can you talk a little bit about collaborating with other like-minded, like-situated liberal arts colleges?
I think there are opportunities, but I think that's another area too where there's a lot of room to grow on that. I think that conceptually we're there, right? People understand that and they know that. It's the how that maybe doesn't, that people don't understand. And I mean people like me don't understand. We're still trying to figure some of that out. I mean, it's not a critique of others. So I do think there are areas like the back of office functions are probably the areas where people have made the most progress on that. But even just sharing, it's just collective action, right? I was talking to the president of Defiance, and she was talking about the retirement programs and just things like that, where, they're kind of no-brainers in some ways, but people get so focused on our own issues that we're not necessarily thinking about that. So AICUO is a place that a lot of us have gone through there. And there's a national organization for that too. The Ohio Federation of Independent Colleges also is a great place to do that. But we're still, I think, we're slow in higher education. We move relatively slowly, right? And so I think that's one of the things that I think we need to move faster. But I think that's an area. When I was at Gettysburg, we tried to do some course sharing on things like, in that case, it was classics education. Gettysburg had a classics program, and a couple of other schools in Pennsylvania didn't. And it was really, the presidents wanted to do it. The provost's office wanted to do it, but we couldn't get necessarily buy-in from sometimes faculty or students. And that was really the key thing there too. Now that was 10, 12 years ago. I think we still, and then sometimes people are like, I don't want to be guilty of this, but you'll say, oh, we tried that. It's like, well, that was a very different time, right? I think post-COVID, a lot of things are different in terms of how we do that. But yeah, I think there are a lot of opportunities and for us to do more of that. And including things, like sharing. We're very, I mean, we do things in nursing, and not all schools like us do that. And so, but there are areas where we don't offer as maybe a robust of a music experience as I wish we did. But if we could find a place that would collaborate where we could share those resources, that would be fantastic. And we do have a long history of being great at music, but just not at this moment. So yeah.
So I'm curious about your own leadership style. Given your journey, what leadership qualities do you individually, as the president, do you most want to model and cultivate among your faculty, staff, and of course, students?
So yeah, it's a great question. For me, it goes back to I think accountability. We need to have, where we have accountability. We have a lot of challenges, and to be authentic about those challenges and not, and it's a challenge because you want to make sure that people understand the gravity of the situation. I've said this at college assemblies. We need urgency, but not panic. And I do think that's but what does that really mean, right? I think that's the catch, is communicating what that means. And to me, it means, things like if we're looking at cost sharing, we have to go into those with both feet. We have to look at them. We have to really, we don't, one of my least favorite things to hear is when you ask why something's done, and they'll say, because we've always done it that way, right? We need to look at everything and see, does it make sense to do that? That, to me, I have to model that too, where it's just because I did something in the past or just something worked for me in the past, I can't assume that you can just make it work here or make it work in this circumstance. And so having that flexibility, being open to being wrong, being challenged. I mean, I will say one of the big adjustments for me is still, I mean, I come from a faculty background. I worked, for a lot of times as an associate provost. And so your word was not final. But I worked in an environment where people felt comfortable challenging and sometimes here, I will say, I've found that people are not always comfortable challenging, and I want to make sure that they understand Like you can, if you think I'm wrong, please tell me I'm wrong. I'd much rather have it come out before than find out, after it's too late to do that. So.
As we wrap up, let me ask you just one final question. If you could issue a challenge or an invitation to the civic leaders or business leaders in our region, either to help sway the narrative and or resolve some of these misconceptions, what would that challenge or invitation be?
So I think for me, it would be the public opinion in the last decade. We're actually, for the first time in that decade, the Pew summer poll show that we're ticking up a little bit in faith in higher education. My challenge would be, and I think there has to be a reciprocal part on parts of college presidents and administrators too, is if you see things that you need from people that are in your workforce, from people that are not going well, then challenge us and have conversations with us. I was just having this conversation about with our dean, and where it's like, if we don't know there's a problem, it's hard to fix it, right? And so now we have to reach out and to see that too, but there's open lines of communication, and it really has to be more comprehensive than maybe what we've done in the past, which is like you'll have one person who's great and you'll say this person is fantastic, but this person isn't great, right? And then we generalize from the ends of one or two in that case, but also just to look at and say like, well, here's the things that we see. I'll give you an example. When I used to be a dean of public policy when I was at Gettysburg, and we did traditional research papers. I'm trained as a traditional political scientist, but I had feedback from some people, some former students who'd gone out into the public policy world, and they said they're going to write enough 10 to 15 or 20-page papers. They need to write a 1 to 2 page policy brief, because that's what they stink at. They're terrible at. And so we just started incorporating that in, and they were right. The students hated it too, by the way. And it's like, but the explanation, and then working together with people who said, like, you want to go work for the State Department, here are some former students or some people that we know that are at the State Department, and they will tell you that this is a skill you need to develop. That made it a lot easier than just because I've always done it this way. So I think having that line of communication where people feel free to reach out directly to me or others in education, and we need to respond to that.
That's a perfect segue. I wish that we could continue the conversation, but we've hit the end of our time. I know that there are a couple more questions in the chat, and I'm going to encourage the individuals who have additional questions to contact you directly. But let me invite everybody, please join me in thanking President Boyer for joining us today and sharing his incredible passion and energy around the value of a liberal arts education and then some. And let me encourage everybody to dig deep in terms of learning more about Hiram. I have to say, I've been delighted for the chance, even briefly, to get to know you, because it's given me an excuse to dig in and to learn more about the great work that's happening at Hiram College. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And I would just second that. About, I see some things in the comment section. I'm easy to find, and Becky knows how to find me. So I'd love to continue the conversation. Thank you so much.